Okay, we're going to try this again. Can you hear me now? Great. Okay, we have sound. Okay, sorry about that. So, hi everybody. I'm going to take your questions. I'll answer anything you want to throw at me. There's just a few things I'm going to say before we start. So the first is I'd like to express my gratitude to everybody who's watching and who's participating in this discussion, this huge global discussion. I'm really deeply grateful for that. And I'm also astounded continually every day by the quality of the questions that I'm receiving and the comments that I'm getting on YouTube. YouTube comments sections are often described as a dumpster fire, as a place to go to get depressed, really good and depressed. That's not the case with this channel. I'm actually quite amazed by it. I would say that 99% of the comments that I see are both intelligent and interesting and uplifting, which is amazing. You wouldn't expect that. So I'm really pleased about that. So thanks to everybody who's participating in these live streams, who's commenting, who's watching the videos, who's sharing them. Because it has certainly profoundly changed my life to be able to do this, that's for sure. So that's great. A couple of other announcements before we start taking questions. So the first is I offer lessons on Zoom, and I've been doing that for a few years now, composition and analysis mainly, although I've occasionally worked with students who wanted to deal with other topics such as music history. And if anybody is interested in taking composition lessons, that is a format that seems to work surprisingly well online. So that's something that I'm offering, and you can find more information about that on my website, and you can also contact me on Twitter and other places. So the next thing I'm going to say is that some of you may not be aware that I also, in addition to the YouTube channel, have a podcast where I do interviews with performers and composers and other people that you can't find on the channel. So to give you an example, I recently did a 2-hour interview with the phenomenally brilliant British pianist Ian Pace, and you can find that on the Samuel Andreyev podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts and Buzzsprout, iTunes, Spotify, a million other platforms, so wherever you listen to podcasts. So that's what I'm going to say for now. Okay, so let's have a look at the questions. Opinion on Mr. Reich. I'm assuming you mean Steve Reich. Well, Steve Reich was one of the first contemporary living composers whose work I heard and enjoyed. And I have somewhat of a personal connection to that in the sense that, and if you've seen the recent video I posted a few days ago about a song that I wrote and recorded in 1999, you'll know that some of the regular collaborators that Steve Reich worked with in the 1970s were people that I had the good fortune to work with on an early album that I did. So those are Bob Becker, who's considered by many to be the greatest living exponent of the xylophone, and Russell Hartenberger, who's an equally brilliant percussionist. Anyway, so that's my anecdotal connection to Steve Reich. As for the music, I've heard it live on several occasions, and it's very beautiful, and it's like acoustically speaking, it's pretty incredible. The thing that strikes me the most, I think, listening to it, is the radically different approach to performing that music requires, because there's very little in the way of sort of individual expression in work like that. I mean, taken from the point of view of a performer, there's not a lot of room to maneuver, because you're in sort of a one layer and a complicated process involving many people who have to be perfectly synchronized. So I've often actually asked percussionists who have played Steve Reich what that experience is like, because it's not something that you can really approach with, you know, a kind of soloistic type of virtuosity. Let's say it's the individual identity of the performer is erased more or less. I'm not convinced by all the works, of course. There are things that are very impressive. Music for 18 Musicians is an obvious example. Four Organs is an important piece. Some of the more recent things I've been a little bit less enamored with. So that's what I can say about that. Okay. Greetings from India. Well, greetings to India from Alsace. It's amazing. I honestly can't believe the analytics. This channel is being watched in 162 countries. Yeah, blows my mind. I don't know what else to say about that. Okay, so Super Junkie Alien writes, do you have any thoughts on composers wishing to not push sounds around while still adhering to Western tuning? I'm especially curious with regards to music written for strings and voice. Well, there's two parts to that question. So the thing about not pushing the sounds around is, of course, a quote from Morton Feldman, who had said that to Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Karl-Heinz, you really can't push the sounds around. Meaning, in other words, that you can't rely too much on systems to make your decisions for you. Another thing that Feldman said, actually, was that he approached the act of composing in the same way that a tailor approaches the act of making a jacket. And he talked about how he sews the buttonholes by hand, you know, so that the suit fits better. So that tells you something about Feldman's approach generally, I would say. And I'm very enamored with that. I think that's a beautiful idea. There was perhaps an overemphasis on system and theorizing amongst certain post-war composers, but that's just a phase perhaps that composers needed to go through in order to explore this brave new land. With regards to not pushing sounds around while still adhering to Western tuning, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. I don't know what the connection is between those two things. With regards to tuning, it makes a huge difference whether you're writing for string instruments or for a keyboard, because obviously you can't influence the intonation of a keyboard instrument unless it's the clavichord, and even there you can't really do very much. Whereas with string instruments, particularly if you're playing Baroque or classical music, you know, you will tune the pitch differently depending on whether it's a third or a root or a fifth, just instinctively. So you know, a pitch isn't just a pitch. It will change and be different depending on the harmonic context. So let's see. Now, do you have any experience writing for the guitar? And if so, what do you think of the instrument and how it's often described as difficult to write for? Well, it's impossible to write for, and I would say, unless you actually have some serious experience with it, either as a performer or with a performer who can show you how it works. I've written for a guitar on a few occasions, but I've always been limited by the fact that I'm not a guitarist. And well, that's kind of a pathetic excuse, isn't it, really? Because you should be able to figure these things out. But maybe it's more that I haven't been able to devote the necessary time to getting to know the instrument properly in a way that would allow me to explore it a little bit more thoroughly. Maybe you just need a guitarist friend, you know, in order to do things like that. I don't know. But the times that I have written for it, I've used it mainly in orchestral and large chamber ensemble sorts of settings. Actually, there's a fairly significant guitar part in my violin concerto, especially the new version, which hasn't been premiered yet, although it will be in the spring. And I wrote for both guitar and mandolin in that, and I love those instruments. But yeah, so I write for them as ensemble instruments generally, instead of as soloistic instruments. So What is your perception on the different teachings in, oh, wait, I lost it. Different teachings of music in Europe, Germany/Austria, for example, compared to France or Italy? Well, I've only studied in France. I can't really comment on other places. I suppose if I had to characterize maybe the differences between those different scenes from a structural perspective, it's not an original comment to say that musical life in France is highly centralized, which means that most people that want to become professional musicians, and be conspicuous, let's say, in the profession, and go to the top, let's say, tend to study in Paris, which is really unfortunate, I think. And I've chosen to live in Strasbourg instead of Paris, although I did live in Paris for 10 years. And I really think that's unfortunate. So what it means is that on the national level in France, there are two national conservatories, so two very high-level music schools. And then the rest are regional or municipal or departmental conservatories. And the idea being that if you want to become a professional, then you start at a municipal conservatory, and then you graduate to a departmental or a regional conservatory, and then all the way up to the top at one of the two national conservatories, which are in Paris and Lyon. If you compare that to Italy, where there's something like 100 schools, 100 national conservatories, compared to the two that we have here, or Germany, where in many medium-sized cities you have excellent conservatories. I mean, it's all throughout the entire country. Of course, there's complicated historic reasons for that, yeah, I would say that the scenes tend to be somewhat more aesthetically diverse in Germany and Italy, at least as far as I've seen, compared to the case here in France, which is not necessarily a comment on the quality of the scenes themselves, let's say, or the average quality of the sorts of music that you hear. It's just an observation that there's a wider range of stylistic options, I would say, in Germany compared to here. So Damian Galinsky writes, do you think it's a daunting task to become a successful self-taught composer? To what extent can studying scores and books make up for not having conservatory training? Well, it's a daunting task to become a composer, period, regardless of the circumstances. Even given the most favorable possible circumstances, it's almost impossible to be a composer. It's very, 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 very difficult. There's a certain effective attrition in this field, whereby people, because of the inherent difficulty and the sort of, the monumental challenges you face when you're trying to do it, a lot of people give up. And that's, as far as I can determine, that's independently of whether they've been to a conservatory or not. Going to a conservatory or a university or whatever it might be, obviously, I mean, the huge advantage there is that it can speed up the formation of a network, a professional network. So that's a good thing. But it's not for everybody, and some people don't thrive in that environment. And there are certainly many hugely successful composers. Well, I don't know if you can say many, but there are certainly examples of hugely successful composers that did not go that route, or that did it only very tangentially. Xenakis is one example. In France today, probably I think the most performed French composer, period, is Pascal Dussapin, if you guys know who that is. Pascal Dussapin, D-U-S-A-P-I-N. He did not go to a conservatory. He studied at a university in France, which is a really unusual thing to do here. Almost everybody goes to the conservatory. So that's a good example of someone who didn't do that. Philip Glass, Steve Reich were not academics at all. Morton Feldman studied privately with Stefan Volpe. you know. So yeah, I think that if somebody is fanatical enough to want to do this, you know, and has the strength of will to push past the obstacles that they're going to face, then they'll find a way. You know, you'll find a way whether you've been to Juilliard or whether, you know, whether you live in a small town in the middle of nowhere. You'll face different challenges, let's put it that way. So, George Evans writes, you've mentioned before the process of teaching yourself to compose away from the piano and being able to imagine timbre pitch clearly. Could you go into a bit of detail of how you trained to do this? Well, that started actually quite early. In fact, it probably started with my very first composition lesson. I had a teacher who insisted on the importance of developing inner hearing. And so one of the first things that we did, in fact, even before we worked on any pieces together, was he would get me to do transcription exercises. He would get me to, he would give me a recording of something, and the assignment would be come in next week with it written out in score. And of course, it was torturously difficult, and it took forever, and I made all kinds of mistakes. But I started doing that when I was about 18 on a regular basis, and that really strengthened my hearing. And partly maybe because you know, you really just did have to sit there and listen and try to hear the intervals. So that's one way to do it. Another thing, I think, you know, if you want to practice inner hearing, which I agree is, you know, it's essential. You need to be able to hear what you're doing on some level if you're a composer. Is you need to sing. You need to work on singing the intervals. If you can't sing them, if you can't externalize even, you know, approximately what it is that you're writing, then it's going to be incredibly hard for you to hear them inwardly with any degree of consistency. So practice singing difficult intervals. You know, take a random note at the keyboard, play an F sharp, and then try to sing the minor ninth above that, or the minor sixth above that. You know, take a random pitch on a keyboard or whatever, and then choose a random interval, and you can practice that. There's all kinds of resources online also that help you to work on your inner ear. So there's no shortage of things. But the other thing I would say is it's very personal. I actually taught ear training for 2 years here in Strasbourg, and I had a wide range of different students. Some of them, you know, came very naturally, and I didn't actually have to intervene that much. We just worked on exercises together from a book called Modus Novus, Modusnovus. If anybody here isn't familiar with that book, it's a kind of arcane torture device that was dreamed up by a Swedish composer called Lars Edlund. These are these absolutely hideous atonal melodies. They're awful, awful stuff. But they're actually useful in terms of strengthening your ear. So you would take these little two or three bar melodies and try to sight sing them, or work on them for a few days, and then come in and try to sing them with accurate pitch. And partly because it's such an unpleasant experience, it seems to actually get results. So anyway, those are a few things you can try. But anyway, yeah, so some people found it incredibly rebarbative and difficult and made very slow progress. And other people, you know, I think there's something physiological, or if not physiological, something innate that makes it, for some people, perhaps they have more facility, I think, recognizing and reproducing intervals with their voice and hearing them inwardly. You can take what you have and maximize it by doing ear training. But I don't know if you can necessarily expand your capacity in terms of what you're born with. I don't know. I'm not an expert on that question. I've simply observed that some students make a lot faster progress than others in that respect. But that doesn't determine everything. You know, if you really have a hard time hearing intervals inwardly, even though you've spent a long time working on it, then maybe you just need to find another method that helps you to write your music. You know, work at a keyboard. or whatever it might be, or work, use a DAW, or use some kind of device that helps you with that respect. Just get it out however you can. So let's see. How would you judge the potential of the theremin in autonomous performance / composition versus collaborative efforts? I used to own a theremin, actually. I bought one in 2002 from a guy in London, Ontario, who was making his own electronic devices. The thing's almost impossible to play. Some people have mastered it, which I find absolutely incredible. But yeah, I'm not hugely enamored of the theremin. I find, it's, given the technological possibilities that exist now, it's an extremely charming instrument, and it's fascinating to watch a gifted player do what they can do on it. But it's very, very difficult to blend with acoustic instruments, I find. It's difficult to blend electronic instruments with acoustic ones generally, but with a theremin in particular. So let's see. Have you ever written an opera / chamber opera? If so, can you describe what the process was like? If not, what might it be like? No, I haven't written an opera. I haven't written a chamber opera. Partly because for a long time my music was concerned with quite compact forms, you might say. I wrote a lot of chamber music. I wrote a lot of pieces in multiple, relatively short movements and sections. And the idea of writing an opera is quite daunting. I would say that not every composer is necessarily suited to it. So Boulez never wrote an opera. Apparently he was trying to in the last few years of his life. He's apparently had a project to write something on Waiting for Godot by Beckett, but it never materialized. Georgi Krutag surprised everybody a couple of years ago and came out with an opera on Endgame, also by Beckett, which is a brilliant opera. And he waited until he was, I guess he would have been 88 or 89 when that was premiered. And Elliott Carter wrote an opera when he was around 90, I think just over 90, called What Next? So maybe in 50 years I'll write an opera. Who knows? But it's not a project that I have right at the moment. I have a couple of ideas in mind, actually. There have been some texts, some literary texts that I've thought could lend themselves well to such a project. But you have to remember, opera is also an intensely collaborative medium. You need to have a spectacular writer and metteur en scène to work with, so that the visual and literary and musical dimensions all work together. A lot of composers seem to have the idea that the opera is theirs and theirs alone, and it's not really. It's a collaborative thing. So, and some people collaborate better than others, right? So that's also a question. Let's see. Do you have any tips for transcribing dense, unusual orchestral textures, like in the symphonies of Hense, for example? Well, I'm assuming that your question relates back to the ear training thing that I was talking about earlier. Like, how would you transcribe something like that by ear? I think you probably can't. You'd have to come up with some kind of a shorthand to describe the textures and their evolution, but trying to actually write down every note would be impossible. There are some things that are just incredibly difficult or impossible to reverse engineer. So if you take Gruppen by Stockhausen and give that to a student, give them a tape of Gruppen and ask them to transcribe it, give it to 10 students, you'd get 10 completely different transcriptions. It's very, very difficult to understand from listening to the piece how the pitches and rhythms might relate to a given tempo, for example, because there's almost no sense of audible pulse in that piece. So that would certainly make the task considerably more difficult. Not everything is a good ear training exercise. You should stick to things that are difficult enough so that you make progress, but not so torturously difficult that you feel like an idiot and you're guaranteed to fail. if that's the outcome of an exercise, then you've calibrated the exercise wrong, right? So you need to have the target be within reach, and if you can consistently hit the target, then you move it back a little bit, and that's how you make progress. You don't start with things that are almost impossible. You'll just get depressed. So what is your ancestry? Your first name looks Western, but your second name looks Russian. My ancestry is that my father's side of the family comes from the Balkans, and my mother's side of the family comes from Cornwall. So there you have it. My paternal ancestors are Macedonian. I might be the only Cornish Macedonian in the world. That's possible. Do you think FZ? Okay, who could FZ be? I love that it's just assumed that I'll know who FZ is. Do you think FZ will be remembered as a great 20th century composer or just another? Part of me wants to say, who cares if anybody thinks that it's a great composer or not? You know, what do you mean by great composer? I suppose a great composer is somebody that whose work has sufficient depth and range and resonance and power so that there's a lot to dig through, and it keeps people engaged long after the composer is dead. I guess that's a great composer. And by those criteria, it certainly appears as though Frank Zappa qualifies. Actually, I have to say, I'm amazed by the tenacity and ferocity of devotion of Frank Zappa's fans. It's not a phenomenon that you see actually all that often, particularly with 20th century composers. I'm curious about that phenomenon, actually. You know, about why the devotion of Zappa's fans is as intense as it is. And I wonder why there aren't more people that have that level of devotion for figures such as Varese or Ruggles or Ruth Crawford Seeger. Let's see. What are your compositional influences? Well, I could talk about formative influences, the things that I was listening to when I first started. The first piece that really made a big impression on me when I was quite young was Beethoven's Eighth Symphony, and that's still my favorite Beethoven symphony. It's a jewel, that piece. And actually, I've been thinking for a long time that I would do a video on Beethoven's Eighth. It's just an incredible piece. And I think something about the clarity of construction and the mastery also of orchestration in that piece is something that maybe hasn't been highlighted quite enough. Stravinsky, actually, in one of his conversation books with Robert Kraft, talks about how the trio of the middle movement of that piece is one of the most perfectly orchestrated things Beethoven ever wrote. He takes the clarinet up to a high G, and he does it with incredible grace so that you almost don't even notice it. But it was not a usual thing to write high Gs for clarinet at that time. Anyway, so Beethoven's Eighth, clarity of construction, the beauty of it, there's not a single wasted second in that piece. I think that's a goal that I tend to gravitate towards, is a kind of compaction in the music where not a second of your time is wasted. There's a lot going on in a small amount of time. And with that respect, certainly Webern was a huge figure for me. You know, I've certainly never written dodecaphonic music. There's a couple of pieces I've done very, very early on where there's a kind of very rudimentary application of some kind of 12-tone technique, but that's something that I moved away from very, very quickly. But the aesthetic world, the beauty of those pieces, their otherworldliness, their poetic intensity of focus, their shockingly new quality. That's amazing. What I also find amazing, I'm having an illumination problem. Let me try that again. Well, I'll start looking like Vincent Price really soon. Completely lost my train of thought. That's how it goes. Okay. Ben Heavy writes, I'm learning your first 4 piano pieces. Thank you, Ben. Are there any solo piano pieces you would like to see them paired with in particular? Yes, actually there are. My model for those pieces, as far as keyboard writing goes, I'm not a huge proponent of 19th century keyboard music. I never really have been. Maybe that's a bit of a blind spot that I have. But I am, on the other hand, extremely interested in early keyboard music. Things like the Fitzwilliam Virginal book, so the English virginalists, were a huge influence, I think, on my keyboard style. And also, certainly, the pièces de clavecin of Rameau were very, very important. I got all kinds of textural ideas by looking at Rameau, and also Couperin and Frescobaldi harpsichord works. The Bach 2- and 3-part inventions, which are not virtuoso pieces, but my God, there's a lot you can learn from them in terms of just clarity of line and texture, and what you can do with extremely few elements. Those pieces are important to me. The English suites also, anything like that. My ambition for those piano pieces, by the way, I just published pieces 5 to 8 in the series. They've just come back from the printer, and they should be available in a week or two. And I'm really pleased with pieces 5 and 8, actually. I worked quite hard on those. I worked on them over a couple of years, partly because there was a number of technical things that I wanted to solve in order to do them. But yeah, they strive for that kind of engraving-like quality where there's a real clarity of line. So that's what I can say. I'm gonna have to change the battery in my camera. I'll be right back. Okay. This is a real shoestring operation. I can't seem to get these live streams right, but thank you for your indulgence. So where were we? Um, Anton Lindstrom writes, "Hi Samuel, you're interested in rare instruments. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the usage of various ethnic or folk instruments in contemporary music. The gamelan is kind of trendy." Yeah, the gamelan's been trendy since Colin McPhee wrote a piano concerto in God knows when was it, the 1930s maybe? That was directly inspired by Balinese music. As far as using ethnic or folk instruments, so I've seen composers do that with tremendous success, but I think it's extremely difficult, and I'm not tempted to do it myself, partly because those instruments have a range of connotations and associations and connections that are not neutral, right? They're associated with a particular context, and I can't approach them just as though they were simply producers of sound, of a particular type of timbre. I can't dissociate them from those things. And incidentally, it's the same when I write for instruments like the piano or the saxophone. I'm always aware of what the repertoire is and what the context is within which those instruments tend to be associated, and I find it very difficult not to think of those things. So you can either work with that or work against it, I suppose. And with that respect, I find it difficult to work to work with those sorts of instruments, but I find them extraordinarily beautiful to listen to. I have a lot of CDs I've got CDs of traditional Bulgarian music that it's just amazing. But I really don't know how I could incorporate some of those sounds into my work directly. I think you can be inspired by, let's say, the sonic thumbprint of these instruments, and it might affect the way that you then write for an oboe or a percussion instrument. With that, in that respect, actually, there's a brilliant solo oboe piece by Iseng Yoon, Y-U-N, if anybody doesn't know that composer, Korean composer, absolutely brilliant, called Piri, P-I-R-I, and it's one of the most intense solo oboe pieces in the entire repertoire, and it's based on a traditional instrument called a piri. So that's a brilliant example of somebody who was able to do it really well. So, have you ever listened to the band Cardiacs? Nope, sorry, I haven't. Maybe someday. Do you ever feel limited by musical notation in regards to conventions with articulations and dynamics? If so, do you try and invent your own expressions of these in your compositions? No, I don't feel limited by them. No, I don't. My notation is actually quite classical in almost every respect. There's nothing. I'm not attempting to push boundaries in terms of the way the scores look or the relationship between the performer and the written score. I just try to put my sounds down the way I want to and be clear about that. And if I need to use somewhat unconventional notations in order to do that, I will. But most of the time, conventional pitch and rhythm notation is enough for me. And you can push those things incredibly far, by the way. Like if you take Fernio, for example, his notation is totally classical. There's nothing in it fundamentally that doesn't exist as a potential in classical or romantic music. But he just pushes those things incredibly far. There's crazy rhythms in Chopin. You have to play at 17 against 16 or whatever, or 23 in the time of, where the left hand and the right hand are totally asynchronized. So, Giuseppe's Etudes are top-tier piano pieces. I don't know those pieces. I'll have to listen to those. He's written a lot of music, and I'm not familiar with everything, but a lot of what I've heard, I've been really impressed by. I think he's really one of the finest contemporary French composers. Absolutely. Yeah, if you guys don't know Giuseppe, check him out. Which works of Stravinsky and his late style, besides Agon and Threni, which you analyzed in your video, would you recommend further listening and analysis? Requiem Canticles. You have to know Requiem Canticles. Beautiful piece. And movements for piano and orchestra. It's like movements for piano and orchestra is like what Webern might have written had he lived in Hollywood. It's like it's dodecaphonic music, but with a kind of Hollywoodish flair. I don't know how else to describe it. It's a beautiful piece though, and also the variations for orchestra, which is a piece that almost nobody plays, but those are great. My enjoyment of music changes based on how much energy I have and how I feel health-wise. Do musicians also experience that? How can I improve my listening/attention? Oh, that's a good question. I'll answer that from the perspective of a composer. I think that the quality of your physical and mental state is really key. I mean, I can't write anything if I'm dead tired and can't concentrate and I'm exhausted and not feeling well or whatever. I just can't do it. You want to bring to bear everything that you have in you to this task, and I think that listening properly is a task that requires your full attention. Something I'm noticing is people are not listening. Well, obviously, people aren't listening in the same way as they were a few decades ago because of the meteoric rise of streaming and Spotify and all of these sorts of things. And if you listen to something on Spotify, you probably have your computer open and you probably got 15 browser windows open, and you might be tweeting and you might be on Facebook and you might be checking your email while you're listening. So that's not probably conducive to entering into that kind of super focused state. I can tell you what I do. I take cold showers. I really recommend it. Take a cold shower every day. It'll work wonders for your ability to focus. Wakes you up like nothing else. So how soon do you think a blend of classical music and electronic music will happen? I'm talking about long performances in theaters extended by electronic music, which people would happily attend to. Well, classical music and electronic music have been blended since the mid-50s. I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Um, long performances in theaters extended by electronic music, well, that happens all the time. You should listen to Licht, the cycle of 7 operas by Karlheinz Stockhausen, which are they're instrumental operas, but with an extremely significant electronic dimension. And the two aspects are brilliantly integrated with each other. And those are amazing theatrical experiences. I've heard a couple of them live. Actually, they did Donnerstag aus Licht in Basel a couple of years ago. I went to hear that twice. That's the first one in the cycle that he wrote, and deeply impressed by that. The electronics are subtle, actually, in that piece. They don't hit you over the head with their electronicness, which is actually a criteria I have for electronic music generally. It's nice when it offers a discrete coloration, but when it's not necessarily the main thing that you focus on. Cyberprimate, why is there a hi-hat in your living room? Do you record drums at home? Well, this is not my living room, it's my studio. But there is a nice hi-hat back there. Well, that's one of the first musical instruments I ever acquired, actually. I think when I was 14 or 15, I wanted to make home recordings. And so I went to a junk shop on Queen West in Toronto and found this completely broken hi-hat, which I bought for $20. And I took it home and disassembled it and tried to fix it up, and found some other drums that were just left by the curb by somebody who, I guess, got fed up trying to learn how to play the tom-toms. I don't know. So I put together this really rudimentary drum kit out of all these pieces that I found here and there. And that hi-hat, I used it on a lot of my early recordings. I used it for years. So I still have it. It's a token of my humble beginnings. what can I say? Are you the best classical music YouTuber, and why? Oh, that's funny. No, I mean, I hope not. You have to hope somebody's doing this better than I am, because otherwise we're really in trouble. Look, I mean, this is an amateurish operation I've got going on. I've got very basic equipment. I just run this out of my office, and I do it, on the time that I'm able to allot to it. But I'm not a professional YouTuber in the sense that it's let's say that it's an important part of my activity, but it's not the essential part of my activity. Mostly what I do is I write music. I'm a professional composer. I think it's extremely important for me personally to communicate, because look at it this way: there's no guarantee that the pieces that I love and I think are important are going to get played indefinitely and people are going to discover them. There's no guarantee of that. You can't assume that somebody who's 15 today is going to find out about the late Stravinsky pieces or about Morton Feldman. Why would you make that assumption? And if you want those things to continue to get played and talked about and listened to, then you have to participate in the creation of an ongoing appreciation and discourse surrounding those things. It doesn't happen by itself. The traditional media outlets have completely abandoned that task, right? And so it's up to individuals to make sure that these things remain an active part of our cultural consciousness. And the institutions surrounding classical music, I'm not really that confident that they're going to survive, or at least not in the present form for all that much longer. And not because of COVID, but because of societal changes that have been coming for the past few decades. We can't make that assumption. And I think people on an individual basis might think about what they can do, to just talk about these things with your friends. Participate somehow. And as far as I'm just a composer, but there are pieces that I think are really important and that I want to make sure people hear and find out about. The way this whole thing started was I was teaching analysis in a conservatory in northern France, in a small town. And I had some really interesting students, and we had some great courses together. I really enjoyed doing that. But it was a class of maybe 10 people. And these analysis classes took a lot of time for me to prepare. I might spend a week studying a piece really closely and then talk about it with the students. And then I thought, well, this is an enormous amount of labor for 10 people who are going to be sitting in this room. And then at the end of a couple of years of doing this, I had quite a lot of material sitting around. And it just seemed obvious to me that you would, want to share that with other people, beyond the 10 people that were able to attend the course. So I just, the first YouTube videos are just me pointing a really cheap camera at myself and delivering a lecture without any edits. I didn't even know how to edit, right? So you can't get more basic than that. And I picked up a couple of technical improvements here and there along the way, but I'm not a full-time professional YouTuber, and I can't compete with those guys really, because I'm not prepared to do that. There are certain things that you need to do in order to succeed at the top levels in the sort of YouTube world, let's say, in terms of how you format the videos, how long they can be, how you package the information, what sort of topics you address, down to minutia such as thumbnail design and that kind of thing. And some of the content that I'm addressing isn't particularly amenable to some of those concerns. So I just do the videos the way I think I should do them, and I don't worry too much about the numbers of who's actually watching them. Although I have to say I'm astounded by the fact that there are as many people as there are watching them, and I'm grateful for that. Chris W., do you have any suggestions for composition books for composition exercises relating to modern harmony? So far, I've heard of the Persichetti book as well as the Mila Uleila's. Sorry, I don't know that name. Contemporary Harmony. I'll have to look at that. Well, there's no such thing as modern harmony, first of all. So you have to be a little bit cautious when you're talking about that. Wait, what does modern harmony mean? Because it could be Phil Niblock. Okay, so Phil Niblock is a guy in New York City who produces these pieces where the score consists of frequencies, right? They're not pitches, they're frequencies that have to be played out in over loudspeakers in a particular setting at a particular intensity for a certain amount of time and so on. They're amazing pieces. I've heard some of them live in cathedrals, and they'll knock your socks off. They're incredible. And that's a type of harmony. There's no is that modern harmony? Is Hindemith modern harmony? Is John Adams modern harmony? Like, those three things have nothing to do with each other. So there's no such thing as modern harmony. And there are different practices, and there's a wide range of different approaches that are being practiced. But it's not something that you can study per se, and it partly depends also on whether you're looking at it from the perspective of a composer or a musicologist or a performer. If you're a composer, you're going to gravitate to certain things more than others. Certain types of harmony, certain styles are going to interest you more than others. And you don't need to learn every single technical aspect of everybody's harmonic language in order to do that. So there are some good harmony books out there for sure, and I think the best ones are extremely personal and extremely biased and extremely limited. But they tell you what a particular person thinks. And I find those sorts of books, these really hyper-focused sorts of books, a lot more useful than books that try to give you a general overview of 20th century harmony, because you can't do that. Too many things happen in the 20th century. You can't boil that down into a book. I tend to recommend the Hindemith book, the Craft of Musical Composition. Hindemith is seriously out of style. Like, admitting to liking Hindemith is a pretty grave social error these days. It'll get you kicked out of some pretty good parties. So don't go around telling people that you like to listen to Hindemith. But his music is, you can actually learn quite a lot from it, and particularly from his book on composition. I think it's very interesting because he talks about reconciling simple triads and complex chromatic chords of many tones, and talks about having a dynamic interaction between those two things, which actually I think is relevant to 2020 because you don't see any dogmatism around those things anymore, and there hasn't been for decades. I think we're seeing a lot of composers who are taking a much more integrative approach to working with disparate materials. So Hindemith is an example of somebody who in the mid-30s was already thinking about how you could actually, rather than exclusively opt for either this kind of neoclassical pandiatonic or a polytonal approach that was popular in France in the 1920s, 1930s, or on the other hand, this sort of hyper-saturated chromaticism of the Viennese composers. Hindemith saw a way that you could actually integrate multiple different harmonic frameworks within the same piece. So that's a good book. So, do you have any tips for learning to write music faster and not getting hung up on the details early? I often lose the thread of the idea in the process of notating or recording the idea. That's a really good question. Yeah, I can't answer that in a general way because so much of it is context dependent. This is the sort of piece you're trying to write, the sort of composer you are, what your style is, what your work habits are. I think it's important to have consistent work habits as a composer and try to set them up in such a way that you can reproduce them over time consistently. I really think that's crucial. And one thing I insist on a lot with my students is, what exactly does your work routine look like? How many hours can you sustain real creative effort before it starts to be a matter of diminishing returns? And be realistic about that. Can you sustain that kind of creative focus for, maybe you can only do it for 45 minutes. Some people, that's where they max out, and after 45 minutes, they get really distracted and fidgety, and they have to go and do something else. Other people can sit there for 3 hours. That's fairly rare. Most people probably can't do that. So, but anyway, you have to figure out what your limits are in terms of sustained concentration, I think, and try to build that into your day in a way that's optimal and productive. So that's one thing. Have good work habits, and that takes a long time to sort out. It took me years to figure out how I could work optimally. And the other thing is, composition is a very complex task, because you're constantly shuttling back and forth between different levels of resolution, let's say, in your work. In other words, between the level of microscopic local detail and the overall level of the piece that you also have to keep in the back of your mind at all times, right? Because it's very easy for composers to get overly focused on the minutiae of the materials that they're working with and not to think enough about the trajectory. One very stupid but nevertheless useful metaphor that I sometimes use is that when you're composing, it's not enough just to have a kind of a beautiful car sitting in your garage. Like, you need to have gasoline, right? You need to have fuel that allows it to actually move and to get somewhere. And very often what I see are composers obsessed with the material, but not actually thinking about the trajectory of how those two things might interact and where the piece is actually going to go. So I think that when you're composing, you have to invent the material and the trajectory simultaneously. That's a bit of a generalization, and there of course are exceptions. There are instances in which it's not appropriate to work that way. As a general rule, and particularly for students, I would say that it's good to have some idea of what the formal principle is going to be in your piece. And that doesn't mean that you need to plan everything out ahead of time. It doesn't mean that. But it might mean that you have to think about questions like, how do the materials interact? Is there a principle of opposition? Are the materials going to interrupt each other without there being any real interaction between them? Is there going to be a succession of non sequiturs or materials that sort of are where you sort of cut in between them like that? Or is there going to be an organic flow in which the music is constantly in a state of becoming, and it's always flowing from one state to the next in a very linear fashion? Those sorts of questions, I think, can help you. And but you can also just, what I often do, actually, if I'm planning out a piece or thinking about what I'm going to be doing, I'll write longhand. I don't always sit down and work on the score. I'll write pages and pages of notes sometimes in words about what it is that I want to do and how the piece is going to evolve. And that can be really helpful too. And you can keep those notes on your desk and refer to them from time to time, and not so that you can follow them to the letter, like a prisoner, but so that you can just periodically take stock of what it is you had intended to do with respect to where it is you are now with the piece. So, what performance opportunities do students in France get? Well, it depends on the student and depends on where they are in France. As I mentioned earlier, France is unfortunately a highly centralized country. So it makes a world of difference if you live in Paris or not. Because the bulk of, I saw a statistic actually, if you guys know a little bit about France, the Île-de-France region is the region that consists of Paris and its outlying suburbs. And approximately 95% of the composers in the country live in Île-de-France. So that means for the entire rest of France, 5%, right? So I'm in Strasbourg, and I know maybe 3 other composers that live here. I'm not saying there's only 4 of us, but those are the those are the 3 that I know. One of them is Hugues Dufour, by the way, who invented the term spectralism. Brilliant composer. I'm very fortunate to know Hugues and to have him in the same city. A lot of people are interested in spectralism, but don't necessarily know the music of Hugues Dufour. Dufourt. You should check that out. He's a very interesting composer. Anyway, yeah, so I'm getting off on one of my famous tangents, but yes, it makes a big difference what part of the country you're in. Have you listened to Out to Lunch by Eric Dolphy? Yes, I have. Yeah, I love that record. It's great. I would love to hear an analysis of it. Well, I don't necessarily analyze everything that I enjoy listening to. And there are some things that lend themselves to analysis more than others. I can't, off the top of my head, get into an extended discussion on why that is exactly, because it's a complicated topic. But there are things that I'm fascinated by, but that I would never in a million years try to analyze. Other things might appear to be impossible to analyze, but actually, if you look at them closely, it turns out they lend themselves quite well to that. That was an exercise that I tried out when I looked at a song by Jandek, who's a kind of very odd outsider artist from Houston. But I did a video about that, and I thought that was an interesting exercise. There's other things too. One of my favorite records is Fear of Music by Talking Heads. That's a fantastic album. I think it would be it'd be very difficult to analyze. And I wouldn't be tempted to do it. Like, I don't know that I would necessarily learn all that much by analyzing it. And when I analyze something, it's in order to learn something, and in order to, deepen my understanding maybe of it, and see if I can pick up something interesting that, it might be aesthetic or philosophical or technical or whatever along the way. So, okay, someone's mentioning this Macedonia thing again. Well, that's a complicated topic, isn't it? The Balkans are extremely interesting in a historic perspective, because of the intermingling of different peoples and religions and the complicated ways that they interacted. And it's actually very difficult to get the history and the geography of those regions straight, because it's so unbelievably complicated. But my paternal grandfather, was from a town in northern Greece. Actually, he was ethnically Macedonian, but I believe he never actually lived in the present-day state of Macedonia. He eventually emigrated to Bulgaria, and then from there to Canada. Okay, so that's that. You are the reason I got into contemporary classical music. Well, I couldn't be more thrilled to hear that. That's great. Fantastic. I hope it's enriched your life. Thoughts on Max Reger? Well, I don't listen to Max Reger, so I don't have any thoughts. I've tried once or twice. Couldn't see much of a point in persisting. John Herman, could you recommend a good book for learning harmony? See, I don't think you learn harmony. I don't know what it means to learn harmony. Harmony isn't really something that you can learn and master. It sounds maybe a bit silly to say it that way. I think of harmony more as an ongoing process, and my thoughts on harmony and my approach to harmony are constantly changing. It's a vastly complex topic. So it depends on what you're trying to do. If you want to, pass an undergraduate course in harmony, then there are some good textbooks that tell you the sorts of things you need to do to pass an undergraduate course in harmony. Um, for a composer, I think it's a lifetime pursuit, and it's never finished. And you can learn a lot from a book, but you really need to learn to listen and to strengthen your ears, listen to a very wide range of music, figure out how it works harmonically, um, and play lots of scores, work on your sight reading, and just, yeah, I don't know what else I can say. It's a huge topic. Mathieu Eisenberg. Oh, hello, Mathieu. How is Freiburg so far? Any striking differences between French and German music students? Greetings from Berlin. Mathieu is referring to the fact that I'm lecturing at the Hochschule für Musik in Freiburg, Germany, which is in Baden-Württemberg, which is the part of Germany that lies immediately adjacent to Strasbourg, where I live in France. So I've interacted with a lot of French students, and now I'm interacting with German ones. Overall differences? It's a perilous enterprise to try to generalize about people along national lines. And I suspect also that the students in Freiburg are different from the ones in Berlin or Stuttgart or Düsseldorf or wherever, because a lot of conservatories have local cultures and attract a certain sort of student. So I wouldn't try to generalize in that sense. Will you have other students on your podcast? I was surprised by the experience of the schools because it seems to be different in Austria/Germany than at least in the UK/USA. Well, that's not surprising because different countries have very different music education cultures and different approaches, particularly with regards to composition. It's not the same at all. Yeah, I've thought about actually doing that again. I did it. So what John is referring to actually is a podcast that I released in December, in which I interviewed 3 students that have worked with me online. So, right, because I do online composition lessons, and I'll say this again for those of you who weren't there at the beginning of the stream. I teach composition and analysis online, and I work with quite a broad range of students from around the world, thanks to this technology. I've been doing that for 4 years now, and that's been going quite well. And I'm amazed actually by the range of things that students have been bringing to show me. It's really incredibly interesting for me as a teacher. If anyone out there watching is interested in the lessons, then you can contact me through my website, samuelandreyev.com, or on Twitter, or there's links also in the descriptions of my YouTube videos. So I interviewed 3 students that I had worked with because I wanted to get a perspective of what it was like to face the professional realities of being a composer for somebody who's quite young and who is still in school, but who is about to graduate and graduate into this new world of this new professional world of composition. And I really enjoyed that conversation actually, because it's just a perspective that I can't have because I did that a long time ago, and I think the landscape has shifted quite a lot since then. And yeah, I would actually like to do that again. So that, I've worked with a fairly large number of students. That particular podcast, I wanted to have a kind of roundtable discussion with people specifically in the US and or in the United Kingdom. But I've worked with many very interesting European students as well, and people in South America and lots of other places, Australia, New Zealand. And yeah, I've often thought it would be interesting to get an even broader perspective on what's happening in all kinds of different parts of the world. So I might do that again. So, I am a huge fan of your podcast, principally the one where you talk about Chris Dench. Thank you. Yeah, if you guys don't know Chris Dench, he's a fascinating figure. Great, great composer. He's originally from England, but emigrated to Australia, and he's sort of associated against his will with the New Complexity group of composers, but he's not really. His music is very different from that. It's amazing music. So I did an interview with Chris Dench that's on my podcast, and you can also find it on the YouTube channel. I'd like to know, what do you think about Kaiosa Yahoo's music? Oh, it's very beautiful. There's some wonderful things from Kaiosa Yahoo. I'm not adequately familiar with her work to discuss it properly on the channel yet, although that's something that I've been considering. So let's see. I'm not doing a good job of keeping up with these questions. There's quite a lot of them. My apologies for any questions that I'm missing, because I'm having to skip over them. There's just too many. Let's see. How did you go about learning French, and do you think learning languages can inform your writing? If so, how? Well, I didn't exactly go about learning French because I'm Canadian and I grew up speaking French and English, so I'm bilingual. And but I did have to learn German as a third language, and I learned German for a number of reasons, actually. And incidentally, when I say learn German, I don't mean to claim that I speak it particularly well, but I learn it. I've learned it at least well enough so that I can teach in German. Although my German still has a long way to go, but I learned it, and I worked hard on learning it for a number of reasons. One of them is that the German-speaking countries are enormously important in the music and classical music world, and I live adjacent to them. I live literally 1 kilometer from the German border. I go to Germany constantly, almost every day, actually. I'm in Germany. So it seemed like it would have been idiotic not to learn the language. So I made a serious attempt at doing that. And learning languages vastly expands your world in ways that are difficult to describe. When you speak a different language, it activates a different part of your brain. You become a different person. It changes your personality. That's a weird thing. If I'm speaking French or English or German, I'm not exactly the same person. And partly because the syntactical structures are different, the emphases are different, the vocabulary is different, the turns of speech are different, and the way you formulate your thoughts, and actually not just that, but the way you think, is conditioned by those things. So that's quite interesting. And also learning different languages means that you can interact with people from other countries in their own language, right? And that's incredibly enriching and revealing. And it tells you a lot about yourself in a strange way, because it causes you to have a little bit of distance with respect to your own language and culture. And you see it very differently when you can interact with people of other cultures. So recommend it to everybody. Learn a foreign language, or multiple foreign languages if you can manage it. Jack Doherty, I find a lot of resources online that claim to talk about how to analyze harmony or something like that, but that really are talking about labeling. Yeah, I think that's true. It's like there's this kind of idea there are some sort of quote unquote textbooks on 20th century harmony where there's like a chapter devoted to pandiatonicism, and a chapter for polytonality, and a chapter for atonality, and a chapter on minimalism, and a chapter on et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which there's something fundamentally wrong about that approach, I think, because composers, these are a posteriori theoretical devices for the most part. It's the same actually with a lot of classical harmony as well, where the labels and the chord names and the functional analyses and so on, a lot of that came actually after the fact. It's important to remember that. So, thoughts on Sibelius? Well, Sibelius is a great composer. I love Sibelius. Listen to the Seventh Symphony. It's a bizarre piece, very, very hard to understand, totally enigmatic, hard to get a handle on. It's like I often wonder, listening to that piece, what holds it together. It's not easy. I'll probably do a video on the Seventh Symphony actually at some point. But yeah, I love Sibelius. I heard a live performance of Sibelius's Fifth Symphony at the Proms last year in London. Probably about the best performance of that piece I've ever heard, conducted by Simon Rattle. And that's a piece that's built out of almost nothing. The themes and motifs are so simple. But the architectonic aspect is amazing. And in that respect, Sibelius has quite a lot in common with Beethoven, I would say, in terms of his compositional processes. What notation program do you use, if you use one? I write my scores out longhand in pencil, and then I do the engraving in Sibelius, and I've been doing that for over 20 years. Actually, I bought Sibelius 2 when it first came out. I'm not saying that Sibelius is the best music notation program, because there are others that are very good, and Dorico has actually proven to be quite a good program as well, although I haven't learned it. Finale is also very good. But I continue to use Sibelius partly because I'm extremely familiar with it, and I'm fast at it, and it does what I need it to do. So I've stuck with it. So Arda2442, hi Samuel Andreyev, what are some of your favorite contemporary operas? That's a hard question. Most contemporary operas are dismal failures. A lot of them are really pretty bad. And the reason for that, I think, has actually a lot to do with two things. One of them is that I think you need to have a really extraordinary dramatic sense in order to write an opera. And you need to understand theater and drama. And why would a composer automatically understand those things? It's like it's another dimension that you really need to master. So you can't just write an opera score as though you were writing just a really long piece. It doesn't. You need to understand those dimensions. The other thing is you need to understand how to write for the voice, and that's not easy. It's seriously not easy. And not only that, but you have to have a distinctive approach to writing for the voice, and you need to know about text setting, and you need to have a sense of, a literary sense also. It's very, very rare for those things, all of those qualities, to coincide in one person, and a strong enough aesthetic sense so that you can make a really strong statement in all of those dimensions, and particularly given the collaborative nature of the medium. So, but I went and heard Einstein on the Beach at Châtelet in Paris maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and that made a huge impression. I'm not what you would call a Philip Glass fan, but you have to admit that Einstein on the Beach is a quite spectacularly original vision. And what amazed me about it was that despite the considerable length of the opera and the relative simplicity of the material, I was not bored for 1 second. It's like you enter into this strange parallel world and you submit to its properties, and it was thrilling. So Einstein on the Beach comes to mind. I also went and saw Brian Fernio's Shadow Time in Paris in 2004 or 5, when that piece was new. That also made a great impression. And then, of course, there's Orfeo of Xenakis, which is also very, very good. That's not really a contemporary opera, but it's recent enough, let's say. So those are 3 examples that come to mind. From your experience, is Montreal or Toronto a larger music scene? Larger, I don't know. They're probably approximately equivalent, if you mean in terms of the number of people who are active and the number of ensembles and orchestras and festivals and those sorts of things. I think it's approximately the same. They're, musically speaking, they're a little bit different, I would say. I think that the musical scene in Toronto is somewhat more conservative than the one in Montreal, and that's been the case for decades. Montreal is a little bit more associated with experimental approaches to composition than Toronto has tended to be, and I think part of that has to do with the excessive influence of the University of Toronto, which is very conservative in terms of its composition program. So a lot of people in Toronto come out of the U of T music program. Montreal, McGill, University of Montreal, and the Montreal Conservatory have a much more experimental focus, I would say, generally. That being said, there are other places to study in Toronto, and I enjoy very much the music scenes of both cities. What do you think about Thomas Adès? Asila is the piece that got me into contemporary music. Would love to hear your thoughts. Oh, Thomas Adès is brilliant. I'm always grateful for the appearance of such talented people. You know, how could you not be? Like he's a great performer and I think quite a remarkable composer. I really enjoyed his piano concerto, which is a recent piece that I certainly recommend. I don't like everything he's written. It's a stupid thing to say. I don't like everything he's written. Who would insist that you like everything by a certain composer? You know, but anyway. But I think the piano concerto is quite a fine piece. Do you like any metal or punk bands? Well, my sisters, when I was growing up, were really into punk. Actually, they actually they were really into punk. They had, you know, one of my sisters had a mohawk at one point, and she was listening to Crass, Alien Sex Fiend, the Sex Pistols. So those records were floating around the house. I tried listening to Alien Sex Fiend once, and it made me nauseous, like it made me physically ill. The Sex Pistols I enjoy. Nevermind the Bogs is a great record. And I've listened to the Ramones and enjoyed that too. I think they're hilarious. So that's what I can say about that. I'm going to do a few more of these, and I'm going to stop in about 10 minutes. How has COVID-19 positively impacted your work life, if at all? The first few months did not positively impact my work life. It decimated my work life in the sense that it made it impossible for me to work for months. So that's partly a question of, you know, a person's circumstances. But I have a daughter, and a young daughter, and the daycares and schools were all closed in France, and so and we were in complete lockdown, so I couldn't work. I couldn't work for months. I know other people whose situations are different, who actually had a very productive time during the first few months of lockdown and got a lot of writing done. So it's the luck of the draw, really, in terms of how COVID-19 affects different people. Although after that, France made the decision that schools and daycares must remain open, even if there were to be a second lockdown, which there eventually was. And in many respects, the subsequent restrictions have been a lot easier to deal with. And from about October onward, I've been able to focus a lot more. So some of you may have noticed that I was not uploading very much. I wasn't producing a lot of YouTube videos or podcasts for about half of the year, and that's why it was just very difficult to work. But on the positive side, I got to spend a lot of time with my daughter, and that was really nice. And there were other things too that were very good about it, strangely enough. So, what about Nina Hagen? Yeah, I've heard Nina Hagen. Yeah, she's fun. Haven't heard that name in a while. Ensemble modern or ensemble intercontemporain? If you're asking me which of those I prefer, none of the above. I'm a bit skeptical about these huge institutionalized ensembles. I think they're going to have a difficult time. You know, what I see are, and not just in Europe, but also in North America and a lot of other places, are the emergence of much more flexible and smaller ensembles that can take on many different shapes. So where should I go to study composition in Paris? Well, I don't know because I don't know you. It depends. It depends on what sort of teacher you would want to work with. There's a wide range of different types of teachers in Paris. I would say I wouldn't necessarily assume that the Conservatoire or the CNSMDP, the National Conservatory, is automatically the place you should go, because there are lots of other places that might be good. So, generally speaking, if you're applying to schools, it's good to try to meet the teachers beforehand and find out about them. Maybe listen to their music, interact with them a little bit before you settle on a school. You want to make sure that it's a good fit. So, who's a better musician, John Lennon or Paul McCartney? Wow, they're totally different. Totally different types of musicians. I like John Lennon because he has so much range, uh, but McCartney has a pretty amazing ear, has to be said. Probably a better ear than John Lennon had. But a lot of his stuff is, kind of sounds the same to me. Are the Beach Boys better than the Beatles? No, the Beach Boys are not better than the Beatles. Sorry. No. And I've listened to basically every Beach Boys album. Yeah. I think that the claims of the Beach Boys being, the Mozart of pop are drastically overstating the case. Sorry to say. There's some good songs though. But the Beatles respected them immensely. Yeah, I've often thought about that. There's something regressive about the Beach Boys and something progressive about the Beatles. The regressive aspect I find really disturbing. Like they want to withdraw into a kind of eternal adolescence. I find that distressing. Very limiting. So anyway, I'm going to stop this now because I'm getting a little bit tired. Oh, okay. So of course you have to send another interesting question that I can't not answer. What is James Joyce's best book and why? Well, the one that I've spent the most time with and consistently returned to is Finnegan's Wake. That's partly because it's built into the book itself that you have to spend a lot of time with it. But my God, what a vision. Probably Ulysses is a better book. but I don't care. I like Finnegan's Wake. His poetry is terrible. Chamber music and Poems Penny Each and all of that. He's not a good poet, weirdly enough. Yeah, super boring poetry. But Finnegan's Wake should be on everybody's bookshelf. Okay, look, so I'm going to sign off, and I'm just going to say one more time that I appreciate very much the quality of the questions, the quality of the interactions on YouTube. Very grateful for it. I hope everybody has a very good 2021. I hope that it brings good things for everybody. Again, I offer lessons on Zoom. There's information about that in the description of my videos. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @SamuelAndreyev. And you can also donate or tip me if you like on samuelandreyev.com/donate, or you can become a patron and support the work that I do directly. And I have to say also, I'm very grateful for the Patreon support. If there's any Patreons here watching this, I'm very, very grateful for that because it allows me to do this. I literally could not devote the necessary time to the channel if I did not have that support. So thank you for anybody who's doing that. And one final thing, the Samuel Andreyev podcast offers conversations with composers and performers that you will not find on YouTube. And so if anybody has not yet subscribed to that, it's available on Apple Music, iTunes, Buzzsprout, and many other platforms. Thanks a lot, and we'll do this again really soon. Good night.